Hi, XFed here. Wanted to do a quick video. I am having to kind of make these where time allows or um, kind of as needed for just getting things off my mind on occasion. And this is one of the latter. Um, it's early May. For context of it's May of 2023. And the topic I want to talk about today, or in this video, is acting outside the law. And there's a lot of negative connotations with that phrase. To act outside the law implies lawlessness, which is severely negatively connotated. But sometimes as I will explain in a moment, there are circumstances where it should not be viewed negatively because the systems that are in place are imperfect. And our democracy is part of that. Our democracy is a grand experiment on the scale of centuries. And so are our legal systems. And it's the same for every other country as well. Maybe not democratic, but every other country has its own systems. Every other country has its own laws, ethics, norms, and culture. And in the US, we have our own. So first I want to talk about the grayness of the law. What do I mean by gray? Well, I mean that in the law, not everything is black and white. Anyone who does any amount of study, moderate study into the law, will learn that there are technicalities. There are finite limits to how quickly and easily the law applies. That's why there are phrases like prima facie, and many times where prima facie does not apply, you have to give preponderance of the evidence, or you have to find direct evidence. And direct evidence is more along the lines of prima facie, but preponderance is not. Preponderance takes time, is arguable, and can be defeated by adversarial tactics and adversarial information. Preponderance is not a perfect system. And in explaining the grayness of the law, think about it in terms of people. People individually see things differently. One person to another sees and interprets the same set of facts and circumstances and events that they experience differently based on not only the limits of what they can see, what they observe, what they know going into it, or in that moment, but also based on their perceptions and their knowledge from history, their biases, their own individual levels of knowledge up to that point, not just the knowledge that they have in that moment or are gaining in that moment. And just as there are large differences in perception about particular events, particular topics, there are also differences in perception on how to interpret the law. That is why law is referred to as a practice, like medical practice, law practice, things like that, because it's not perfect. The law is gray. and very rarely is it black and white. And so that brings me to what I wanted to really talk about today, which is, over time, imperfect systems and laws, because no system will ever be perfect, so long as humans create these systems and humans interact with these systems, no system will ever be perfect. And the laws are also reflective of the context in which they were created. So technology, culture, and a number of other things that are mutable, they change over time, those affect the laws, and the laws have to be updated to reflect whatever the new norm is. And sometimes they're not updated. Just as a quick example, there was a time where I lived in Texas, and I'm not gonna indicate where it was at, but there were still, this was back in the early 2000s, there were still laws on the books from the 1800s, and one of the laws I remember laughing about was it was illegal to drive an automobile down Main Street. You could only ride a horse. And that law was still on the books, but not enforced. Black and white. Black and white in the context of, the early 2000s, people broke the law regularly. There was a prima facie showing that they were driving automobiles down the road and nobody was riding horses. But that law was created in the context of when it was passed, which was in the 1800s. Or the early 1900s. And I think the law, it may have also been that they weren't supposed to be, it was updated in the early 1900s to reflect automobiles as well, but originally was passed in the 1800s to address people riding carts, like horse-drawn carriages and cart, like the wagons, down Main Street. They didn't want that, so they passed a law making it so you could only ride a horse down Main Street. And that was the context of the law, and that law was never updated, was never addressed, was never removed from the books. It still existed, and it was funny, from the modern perspective. It was funny looking back and seeing this law that had been on the books for 150 years and no longer applied, and finding that you were breaking the law regularly by doing these things, but nobody was going to enforce it. And so that example aside, similarly, our modern times are not immutable. It's constantly changing. Our culture, our technology, everything is constantly changing. And as a result, the laws that we have on the books now, the laws that we live by, pretty frequently come across circumstances and situations that they were never designed to address. That perhaps the change in culture or technology have made them not necessarily useless, but less effective, or technology and culture changes may have created loopholes that the laws do not apply to and the laws have not caught up to. And over time, some people choose to engage in what I'll call ethically questionable activities with these loopholes. They do things that other people may not want them to. And those activities they range from not explicitly illegal, because the law does not apply to the particular set of circumstances, to explicitly illegal, but just like the law with the horses and the cars, enforcement becomes an issue. It's hard to enforce something if you don't know it's happening. And I can't specifically say what I'm talking about, but there are circumstances that I'm aware of where it's hard to enforce the laws because people don't necessarily know what is happening, even if it is explicitly illegal, and even if it's not illegal, it's definitely questionable. So then we arrive to the other part that I wanted to talk about. Sometimes there are people who wish to engage in ethical corrective activity. They're trying to correct the others who are behaving in a way that is ethically questionable, maybe even illegal. And those individuals have a very hard time doing so because the law does not help them. The laws that are in place are not updated to accurately reflect the circumstances for those individuals involved, and therefore those individuals do not have the law on their side in trying to correct perceived wrongs or things that should not be happening in their opinion. And that's where it gets really dangerous, because this comes down to opinion at that point, and differences in perception and knowledge. And you know, we have a very long human history of this, where people have differences in perception and people engage in activities to try to correct others. And I'm going to kind of jump to the top and then come back down, but I'm going to start with von Clausewitz, Karl von Clausewitz. In the book On War, he talked about how war was an extension of politics and the state, and that essentially war was a tool to be used in order to effect changes that you wish to see in non-sovereign cultures, territories, and things, basically interactions between states. States were to be viewed kind of as people, and one state interacting with another state could be considered a fight if the states didn't agree to take the same course of action, and that fight would be represented as war. That's kind of a rough explanation of what he was getting at. And we have a very long history of this. We have millennia, many millennia of history of this. And in coming back down to an American perspective, not a kinetic war, but a cultural war. An example in the US would be the Civil Rights Movement. And I'm going to explain the movement in a couple of different ways to help kind of explain how these laws were inadequate to deal with the problems that were encountered, and then explain how people chose to act outside the law, both from the perspective of ethical behavior and also from the perspective of unethical behavior. So let's start with the unethical. Most Americans are pretty familiar with groups like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. And the Klan was a pseudo-political group, and in modern times is considered a terrorist organization. that would use various means, including coercion, intimidation, and a number of other things that are explicitly illegal, in order to prevent African Americans or other minorities from expressing or engaging in civil liberties. Things like voting, desegregation, stuff like that. And obviously these groups were acting well outside the law. They were doing things that were illegal, and to a degree the American public wasn't really aware of a lot of it. They were aware in general that these things were happening, but the American public in general across the states may have been aware that these kinds of things were happening, and that the Klan and other folks were like them, were engaged in illegal activity, and may have had an understanding, a basic understanding, that people were being killed, maimed, murdered, tortured, but it didn't click. You can talk about it, just like in these videos, you can talk about it, but experiencing it, seeing it, changes people. And the American public started understanding how terrible what the Klan and people like them were doing, things that were not really apparent to the public, when the people who chose to, I'm not going to say act outside the law, they acted within the law, but they did things that were socially and culturally prohibited by the Klan, by these groups that were controlling the narrative and controlling the sharing of information. And these individuals, they acted from a moral perspective and with anger to counter the Klan and other people like them, and to counter the majority. And a specific example of this is the case of Emmett Till. I'm not an authority on Emmett Till and the culture in the South, but I am aware of what happened to that 14-year-old boy. And I'm going to save my audience the explanation. They can do their own research. I'll leave a link to the Wikipedia page regarding it. But Emmett Till's mother and her decision to have an open casket funeral was outside the cultural norms and outside the expected behavior that the Klan wanted. And when the public became aware, and there were photographs of the aftermath of what happened to Emmett Till, the American public's perception changed. And that was a cultural war. That was part of it. That was the civil rights movement. And at the time, the people involved, the law was not on their side. There was still segregation. There was still Jim Crow laws. In fact, the law was against them. But democracies in general have a tendency to go toward more liberties instead of less, more acceptance instead of less. We become slowly more open-minded. We may take 2 steps forward and 1 step back at times. But in general, democracies tend to become more, for lack of a better word, liberal. And I don't mean from the perspective of modern politics. I mean from the perspective of open-mindedness and inclusive. So I'd like to shift now from these examples to discussing the risks involved with this kind of behavior. The reality is that those who choose to engage in this kind of behavior on both sides, the people who are doing things that are ethically questionable and the people who are doing things that are trying to act with what they believe to be right. And just to be clear, history ultimately decides who's right. Sometimes both sides believe they're right. Sometimes it's clear, though, that one side is oppressing the other. And in that circumstance, it's pretty easy to see who is on the right side of history. But to be clear, it's not always clear. To be accurate, the distinction of who is right and who is wrong is not always clear. Sometimes war and the fog of war clouds things. People do things in the fog of war that they might not otherwise do, or groups do things that an individual might not choose to engage in, but as a group collectively would, due to peer pressure and a number of other factors. There's a lot of psychological research on that. I'm not going to go into it right now. However, in general, the group that is engaged in oppression is usually also aligned with the current status quo, whatever that culture or law or whatever system we're talking about. They are typically aligned in the same fashion, and they don't want the status quo to change. They don't want the culture, the laws, whatever it may be. They don't want it to change. They want it to exist as it is. And on the other side are the people who are trying to challenge it, trying to change it. Some historical examples, just to go through them. And I selected these intentionally just to kind of show outcomes also of how dangerous this is. And I'm going to discuss that in a second, but I'm going to show what happened to each of these individuals. So Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King Jr., to be clear. We're talking about Martin Luther, the man who allegedly went up to I believe it was the Catholic Church, and nailed his complaints to a door because he disagreed with what the church was doing. He had ethical and moral problems with it, and ended up essentially founding Lutheranism. I'll wait until I get to the next section. I'll talk about what happened to him. The same for each of the other examples. Thomas Paine, author of Common Sense, considered one of the founding fathers of the United States, and a very philosophically minded individual. Edward Snowden. I'm not going to say he's on the same perspective or level, but his willingness to take action when he saw something that he fundamentally believed and knew to be wrong, is on par with Thomas Paine's writings and Martin Luther nailing his complaints to the door of the Catholic Church. So now that I've given you the three examples I'm going to talk about, let's talk about the systems that they were up against and the outcomes as a result. So when you're taking on an existing system, typically these systems, they have mechanisms in place to prevent that kind of change. And it can be anything from, the military, using military force to affect change, to depending on the type of government, that could be like dictatorial or autocratic. You could have things like the modern equivalent of the FSB. You could have things like the Stasi. And to a lesser degree, you could have governmental systems and mechanisms designed to focus on counterintelligence and monitoring of these groups. These groups which are not necessarily foreign created, and don't get me wrong, I don't want to get into the world of intelligence and counterintelligence, because it's a very messy world. But what I mean to address with that is sometimes these groups are monitored for legitimate reasons. Many times they are monitored because they are challenging the status quo, though. And whether or not that's ethical, that's something for at least democratic countries to collectively decide whether or not we believe it should be happening. And referencing an earlier example I provided, the civil rights movement. So many of the civil rights leaders within the United States were monitored by agencies such as the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigations. They were spied on, and there are other agencies that were involved depending on the circumstance. Outside of Martin Luther King Jr., there was somebody who was a little bit more of a militant leader, believed in, my understanding, rough understanding, using force as necessary. And later in life, also my rough understanding, reformed their beliefs and became more like Martin Luther King Jr. And that was Malcom X. The name he was born with was Malcom Little. My point in bringing him up is not necessarily the differences in his approach, but he was also monitored by counterintelligence, including the CIA, according to publicly available news sources. And the reason that that is becoming more publicly apparent is because apparently the CIA knew that Malcom X was going to be, that an assassination attempt was going to take place, and did nothing to intervene. The U.S. government did nothing to intervene in the attempt. And that attempt ultimately took his life, according to the lawsuit that is currently going on because Malcom X's family is suing the U.S. government presently. All of that is to say that no matter what a group's ethical purpose is, they're most likely going to be monitored, they're most likely going to be tracked, they're most likely going to be acted against to try to prevent whatever it is they're trying to change to the status quo, be it culture or law. A lot of times the laws and the rules that are involved, they're used against these individuals. His history tends to prove them to be either, you know, right or righteous or ethically minded, but in the moment, no. In the moment, they are enemies of the state a lot of times. So going back to my examples, Martin Luther, he was excommunicated from the church, and at the time that was an extremely dangerous thing. There were people trying to kill him. Thomas Paine, founding father, was an idealist, and ultimately he upset the other founding fathers, despite his writings, despite his contributions to not just common sense, but also the Declaration of Independence, his influence in the Constitution, and a number of other things. Despite all of that, he was essentially excommunicated by the United States. And as I recall, his final years were spent in France. I don't know if he helped in the French Revolution. I'd have to look, but in essence, he was unable to live in the country that he helped found, for being an idealist and for trying to change the system more than the other founding fathers were willing to do. And to an extent, that makes sense from a democratic perspective because it is the majority, but the other founding fathers made it difficult for him to live here because he wanted more change. Edward Snowden, as an example in this case, I'm going to be very careful about what I describe here because of my own legal obligations, but Snowden saw something that he believed firmly and knew based on law to be illegal going on. And he took steps in order to prove that it was happening. And from a personal standpoint, and from the perspective of not being in his shoes, because that makes a huge difference. I don't agree with everything that he did. I don't agree with exactly what he did and how he did it, because it created a lot more danger. But I also understand why. I understand not only philosophically why he did what he did, as far as giving the media access to what he gave them access to. I am being very careful not to discuss a lot of things, but he gave the media access to some stuff, and I understand why he did that. And there's independent people who have discussed it and verified it. I'll include a link in the description regarding it for anybody who's curious about what Snowden did and why. I cannot officially comment on it, or even unofficially comment on it, as far as the nature of what was discussed, or addressed in the book that I'm going to include the link for, but and I'm not endorsing it in any way, shape, or form. I have to make a bunch of legal disclaimers here, so I apologize to any watchers, but there's reasons for it. I don't endorse everything. It was just, to me, an information input and consideration and differing perspective, and it was just one of many that I have reviewed over time, and doing so in the narrow confines of what I am legally allowed to do as a government employee. But I'll include the book below, and maybe some other resources. I don't know, it's a little... I may need to cut this entire part out. Anyway, going back to what I was going to talk about with regard to Snowden's outcomes. He faced charges under the Espionage Act and other laws. He is still an outlaw, and the United States still has open arrest warrants for him and open extradition requests that Russia just simply ignores. And other people, like some of the civil rights folks, they face charges not only under espionage but also sedition and a couple of other laws. And essentially, all of that is to say that these individuals who wish to bring about change to the status quo, for whatever system it is they're trying to change, they go up against that system, and the system uses its full force to try to prevent people from changing it. And it's not necessarily immediate. The outcome is not necessarily immediately determined. Sometimes over time it changes, like the civil rights movement as an example. When it first started, you know, they were up against extraordinary odds. I'll phrase it as that. Perhaps impossible odds. And they persisted because they didn't have a choice. It wasn't, you know, people who haven't experienced oppression to that level will not understand, but sometimes they will think that there's a choice in reviewing history. And for those individuals who lived through it, there was no choice. There was no, you know, I can understand and empathize with civil rights leaders. To them, the choice was continue a system of oppression that had existed for hundreds of years. And that could get worse. Realistically, history had shown that it had gotten worse at times. Or push, fight in your own way. Maybe, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for nonviolence, but that didn't mean he wasn't fighting. Why We Can't Wait. If you haven't read that book, I'll include a description below, but he talks about morally corrupt laws that were passed specifically to engage in immoral behavior and things that were anti-democratic for their time, that were still on the books and allowed to happen. Things that today we would probably revolt over. You know, we're talking, if they were reenacted today, we might have a revolution in this country. And I'm not, just to be clear, I'm not advocating for a revolution. I don't endorse violence as a means to enact change. Violence is supposed to be towards the last resort, and violence should only be considered in response to severe events like violence being enacted. I'm a little bit of a moderate on that perspective because of my military background. So to me, I view the laws of war. You have a right to defend yourself. You have a right to engage in use of force necessary to stop war, to prevent a war, or to end a war. And there's discretion. And I'll include the general laws of war. Very few people know about them. It's called International Humanitarian Law. It's a very ironic name. I don't know who came up with it, but the laws of war. I'll include the general tenets of the laws of war. I don't remember all of them offhand, but it's like distinction, basically matching force, and a couple of others. And I advocate for that from the perspective of a defensive standpoint, that you can only act with force if acted upon by force, or learning that force is going to be acted upon against you. So with all of that said, because this was supposed to be a short video, but it ended up being pretty long. I wanted to talk about what it's like to be in the shoes of these individuals, because I empathize with them. I have a decent understanding of what it is like to be them. These individuals are acting against the system, sometimes directly against the laws, sometimes intentionally breaking the laws, and facing and accepting the potential consequences of doing so. So what these people do, the ones who wish to bring about what they view as positive change or democratic change in the circumstance of American democracy, they're guided simply by their ethics, their moral principles, and reason. You know, education and critical thinking, reasonableness. You know, in law, there's a reasonableness standard. I'll include a link for that as well. But essentially that and ethics are their guiding principles in convincing others that they are right, and in trying to build majority and consensus amongst the majority that this is the right way to do things and that the system needs to change. And while doing so, you know, they have to risk these dangers. They have to risk the severe potential negative consequences of their actions. And sometimes, like in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcom X, sometimes they die for it. Sometimes, like in the case of Mahatma Gandhi, who sought independence from British rule, sought an independent India from Britain, and was imprisoned for many years, beaten, starved. Other people that joined him, you know, they faced similar consequences. Many of them died. All of this to say that ultimately history and the way we look back at history determines who is right and who is wrong. Sometimes it's the winners who get to decide that, even if they were wrong. Sometimes it's the losers who end up winning, though, in the long run, even if it costs them their life. And all they can do in their circumstances as they exist and operate outside the law, around the law, or in direct opposition to the law, is just be guided by their ethics and reason. So that's really all I wanted to say. I know it's kind of a very abstract topic altogether, but yeah, that's kind of all people in those situations can do. Just act in good faith. Try to do what they believe is right. So, well, that's going to wrap it up. This this video ended up being way longer than I thought it was going to be. So, I'll be recording more later. Maybe not today, but soon. And I'm going to try to keep a relatively regular upload schedule, but not that I have many subscribers, but for anyone who is interested in watching, try to keep a regular upload schedule to give you food for thought. Anyway, appreciate your time. XFed out.